investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear the testimony on the Fish and Wildlife Service gone wild, examining Operation Longtail Liberation. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chairman and the ranking member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other member statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. With the non-subcommittee members participating, I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I think we have Mr. Whitman from Virginia. I now recognize myself for my opening statement. Good morning, everyone. I would like to take a moment to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for coming before this committee today to discuss the Fish and Wildlife Service gone wild, examining Operation Longtail Liberation. First, I would like to acknowledge that the men and women who serve us as special agents for the Fish and Wildlife Services generally do incredible work for our nation, and they have my great appreciation. However, I believe that leadership has failed to support them. Today, the committee will examine the Fish and Wildlife Service's failed covert investigation in the Kingdom of Cambodia, Operation Longtail Liberation, which attempted to expose the alleged illegal exportation of wild-caught long-tailed macaques, falsely labeled as captive bred from Cambodia to the United States. The long-tailed macaque is the most traded non-human primate in the world because they are necessary for medical research, including the development of drugs, vaccines, biomedical research, and treatments. The United States is considered the world leader in medical testing and research. As demand has grown for the long-tailed macaques, spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States sought to establish a domestic industry for supplying non-human primates for medical testing and research purposes. In response, radical animal rights groups such as PETA and the Cruelty Free International have aggressively lobbied the Fish and Wildlife Services to classify the long-tailed macaque as endangered, and therefore halt all imports to the U.S. Meanwhile, China is taking steps to dominate the world trade of non-human primates. If they accomplish this, China will lead the world on medical research and testing and subsequently control the pipeline for any new medicines, vaccines, and treatments. I want to be clear here. We're all talking about potential cures for cancer, Alzheimer's, things of that nature, not just a COVID vaccine. From what the committee has observed throughout our investigation, poor leadership at the Fish and Wildlife Service, a lack of establishment guidance for investigations, and influence from radical nonprofits led to the deeply flawed Operation Longtail Liberation. The investigation ended in embarrassment. After 5 years, the operation resulted in an 8-count indictment, but only one person stood trial in the U.S., a Cambodian official, for a brief 2-week trial that resulted in an acquittal of all charges. Additionally, 2 American citizens from domestic companies involved in the trade of non-human primates are listed in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators. These individuals were never provided the opportunity to clear their name. The unresolved legal situation continues to harm their businesses and the reputation of the domestic industry for non-human primates. However, the committee is most concerned with the methodology used for this ill-fated operation. To start, the Fish and Wildlife Services conducted Operation Longtail Liberation without notifying the Cambodian government. This violates policy for international investigations and places undercover agents in compromising positions while operating in a foreign country. The agency also reportedly failed to operate in accordance with the Department of Justice for this investigation, instead choosing to run this covert operation on their own terms. Perhaps most alarming, the Fish and Wildlife Service introduced national security vulnerabilities to their investigation when they contracted a Chinese national to gather information on behalf of the United States. The service paid this informant approximately $225,000 and generously moved him and his family to the United States, all at the expenses of the American taxpayer. Cruelty Free International, a radical animal rights group, first introduced the services to the Chinese national, who was employed at a primate facility in Cambodia at the time. The American people deserve an explanation for these and other mistakes made throughout Operation Longtail Liberation, and for the Fish and Wildlife Service's close relationship with PETA and Cruelty Free International. The committee has received information that PETA on 2 separate occasions allegedly obtained the documents and images from the indictment and the trial that had not yet been released to the public, meaning someone leaked the information to PETA. PETA and Cruelty Free International have benefited from the publicity of the Operation Longtail Liberation through their substantial fundraising efforts focused on classifying the long-tailed macaque as an endangered and banned all imports of non-human primates. Clearly, the Department of the Interior is a mess under President Biden-Harris's administration. There's no accountability at any level for their failures. While I recognize this investigation may have been begun under the last administration, it was allowed to spiral out of control under this administration, and now there are real consequences. We cannot risk handing over our medical research and ultimately our drug and vaccine pipeline to China for the sake of a faulty investigation. I will now recognize the ranking member for her opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I just want to start by saying this is a extremely difficult topic, and I think obviously we're going to hear a lot about the case today, but for me personally, listening to the treatment and illegal trafficking of primates is a very difficult topic. As was said, long-tailed macaques are the most traded primate in the world. In the U.S., they're used to test medicine and vaccines before they are used for humans. And in theory, these monkeys are bred in captivity specifically for that research. They have to be captive bred because wild macaques often carry diseases that can skew the results of a study to determine if a drug will cause health problems in people. And wild populations are increasingly endangered, and poaching is a huge threat. But let me be clear about my personal position on this issue. I believe that we should not be doing human testing on primates at all and need further alternatives to address our medical and other needs. But sadly, many of these primates are continuing to be caught in the wild, poached from their natural habitats, and shipped to the United States under falsified permits. Because the true source of these primates has been altered, this process has been called monkey laundering. In 2017, Fish and Wildlife Service agents began an investigation into a major monkey laundering ring. They looked into a Chinese company called Vanny Holdings with these breeding facilities in Cambodia that were allegedly exporting large numbers of wild macaques into the U.S. These are not captive bred under falsified permits required under the international treaty which regulates these, which is known as CITES. Vanny was using corrupt officials in high places in Cambodia to help falsify those permits, and one of those officials was arrested when he came through the U.S. In the end, this individual was acquitted not because there was not a crime, but because they didn't have sufficient evidence to show the conspiracy. But there is little dispute that the monkey laundering scheme was happening thanks to the meticulous investigations conducted by Fish and Wildlife agents, which are our federal law enforcement who conduct these investigations. It is apparently a well-known industry secret. In recent years, the price of a single macaque has risen to as much as $60,000 per animal. To maintain the supply of profitable monkeys, this multi-billion-dollar animal importation and research industry has invested a lot of time and money into lobbying, apparently into Congress now. And at least one of the majority's witnesses reflects that investment. There are outstanding indictments for several other individuals affiliated with this monkey laundering ring, and the investigation is continuing to be ongoing. And we are still here in the minority trying to understand why exactly this hearing was called in the middle of a federal law enforcement investigation and trial. Let's be clear, the agents of Fish and Wildlife Service did their jobs, and they did them correctly. They followed investigative procedures and standards. They received the appropriate approvals and revealed serious flaws in the supply chain of these monkeys. And in fact, the investigation was initially authorized under the Trump administration and continued under the current administration. Authorization was given for the informant and compensation was given, and the Trump administration renewed this investigation 4 times. Why? because it's a very serious issue, and transnational organized crime, wildlife trafficking are all wrapped up together, and this is why we do this kind of federal law enforcement. And the proceeds from this organized wildlife trafficking often funds terrorism abroad. So the attacks that we're about to hear in this hearing today are questionable, I have to say, because we know that our federal law enforcement did what they were asked to do and that this is an ongoing investigation. But I want to be clear, we need alternatives. We cannot continue to put our country and our communities at risk, and also these animals, and I believe it is inhumane. I also want to close by highlighting an urgent and unresolved problems related to this case. In New Mexico, we have more than 24 chimpanzees who are sitting in limbo in a primate facility that we have been trying to get released. And similarly, Charles River Laboratories is holding 1,000 Cambodian macaques of mixed and uncertain origins because of this case. Those animals could be killed, they could be sent to another country, or they could be put in an animal sanctuary. And it is our hope that the importers who made a lot of money on this monkey laundering scheme will foot the bill to make sure that those animals are safely transported and put in the care of a sanctuary. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her comments. I'll now introduce the witnesses to our first panel. Ms. Martha Williams, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Department of Interior, Washington, D.C. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. Your whole testimony will be submitted to the record. What you'll do is you'll see, I think you can see the green and red and yellow lights. Okay, everybody, you lost yours. You'll have to focus right up here if you're talking, okay? But when you see the green, you're ready to go. When you're yellow, start closing up, and red, shut it down. So with that, I now recognize Ms. Williams for her 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today to discuss just how important it is for our nation's well-being and defense that we work together to combat wildlife crime. This is a bipartisan issue. Since the early 1900s, Congress has passed laws to facilitate legal trade in wildlife and prevent the illegal trade, including the Lacey Act, CITES, the Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, through our Office of Law Enforcement, is the lead federal agency for protecting natural resources and effective enforcement of these criminal and civil laws. Wildlife trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar illicit industry carried out by highly organized and dangerous transnational criminal syndicates that are increasingly diversifying into wildlife trafficking as an avenue for profit, along with other criminal activities including drugs, weapons, and human trafficking, money laundering, and terrorism. These organizations pose a serious threat to our national security, economic prosperity, global health, wildlife conservation, and community stability. The work of our law enforcement office is critically important to disrupting wildlife trafficking. In 2023, our special agents were involved in over 9,000 wildlife crime investigations that resulted in nearly $3 million in fines and penalties, over 60 years of prison time, and 222 years of probation. Our work levels the playing field for law-abiding businesses, brings criminals to justice, and protects the national security interests of the United States. Because many of our investigations into wildlife trafficking involve convergence with other crimes committed by criminal syndicates, our special agents work closely with the Department of the Defense, DEA, Homeland Security, and more. All of our services investigations are carefully coordinated with Interior solicitors and the Department of Justice and assistant U.S. attorneys. We also coordinate with the State Department on any international investigation. Combating wildlife trafficking and transnational criminal syndicates is not a partisan issue. There has been bipartisan support for this work across parties and across administrations. President Obama established the Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. President Trump issued Executive Order 13773 on countering transnational criminal organizations, including those involved in wildlife trafficking. President Biden has continued these efforts, and Congress has supported this work through passage of the Bipartisan End Wildlife Trafficking Act. The investigation that is the subject of today's hearing is also nonpartisan. The last administration initiated the investigation that we have continued under this administration. This investigation targeted individuals who allegedly conspired to poach macaques from the wild, launder them through Chinese-owned captive breeding facilities in Cambodia, and export them to the United States with fraudulent CITES permits issued by corrupt officials within the Cambodian government. This is an active, ongoing investigation. While one of the individuals has been tried, there are 7 additional indicted individuals with outstanding arrest warrants. To avoid compromising any criminal proceedings, there are law enforcement and legal matters that I will not be able to comment on today. This alleged illegal activity undercut companies operating legally, led to corruption with a foreign government, and put imperiled species at further risk, and potentially compromised the integrity of the biomedical research in this country by introducing wild macaques with high zoonotic disease risk into the supply chain, all for money. I want to emphasize the service understands the importance of life-saving biomedical research. There is not, and never has been, a ban on the import of long-tailed macaques into the U.S. Legal imports of CITES-listed species are commonplace. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today to shed light on our nation's interest in combating illegal wildlife crime through investigations such as the one that is the subject of today's hearing. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Now we're going to hit our members for their questions. First one up as Vice Chair is the member from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Williams, as you're aware, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service participated in the arrest of a high-ranking Cambodian government official in the JFK airport as part of this investigation in November of 2022. Mr. Cree was detained in the airport, arrested, and denied access to an attorney or his embassy staff before being questioned, despite clearly not understanding his rights. So I want to put aside for a second any crimes that may have taken place. Mr. Cree is basically your counterpart, but for Cambodia, which is a friendly nation. Now, if you were arrested in a friendly nation while traveling on official government business with a diplomatic passport at a minimum, would you have expected to have access to an American embassy before being interrogated, especially if that is a right guaranteed by that country?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Collins, I first want to answer that we did follow all required procedures.
I think it's just
the answer is I would not, frankly, from this government, entertain corrupt dealings. So I would never be at risk of that.
It's just a yes or a no question is all I was trying to get.
Could you repeat the question then, please?
At a minimum, would you have expected to have access to an American embassy before being interrogated if that's a right guaranteed by the country?
I can't answer that, and that I would not be in that position.
That's a basic law question. So, okay, let's
Well,
put
Congressman Collins-
aside. We only have I'm down to 3 minutes. Putting aside any crimes that could have taken place here, again, as Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, do you expect your law enforcement officers when interrogating suspects, either domestic or foreign, to uphold the law? Just yes or no?
Absolutely.
All right. And what type of training did they receive to ensure that this happens? Because if it's not happening, I mean, honestly, the facts of the case don't matter, and I'm sure that we all agree that America deserves better.
Mr. Chair, Congressman Collins, the facts of this case have borne out in trial. There are also, it's an ongoing criminal investigation for which there are remaining 7 arrest warrants were those individuals to come into this country. But our law enforcement officers are specially trained. with years of experience, and they put their lives on the line day in and day out to carry out their duties in defense of this country.
Director Williams, in Chapter 16, 742B of the United States Code, it lays out the requirements for the position that you hold. Specifically, no individual may be appointed as the director unless he or she is, by reason of scientific education and experience, knowledgeable in the principles of fisheries and wildlife management. Did you have scientific education and experience prior to your confirmation to this role that satisfied this requirement?
Mr. Chair and Congressman Collins, I absolutely am knowledgeable in the principles of science and biology. I have a long record of experience in working with these issues.
So do you believe that this is a frivolous requirement in the law, given your educational background coming into the position?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Collins, I believe that my appointment adheres to the law.
Has the DOI Solicitor's Office ever weighed in on this matter to determine whether or not you're holding this position illegally or legally?
Mr. Chair, I believe that there has been litigation that was dismissed repeatedly on this matter.
I'm running out of time, that's my problem. The committee has learned that the Fish and Wildlife Service failed to inform or involve the Cambodian government during the Operation Longtail Liberation, as revealed during the trial of Cree and the Deputy Director of the Department of Wildlife and Biodiversity there for the Cambodian Forestry Administration. Why did the service conduct this operation in Cambodia without first seeking the consent or involvement of the Cambodian government?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Collins, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement did seek and work with the State Department, with Homeland Security, with a whole number of other organizations. They did not go through the Cambodian government for the very reason that they were concerned, and we had credible evidence of corruption within those individuals indicted in this case in the Cambodian government.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to yield back. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia is now recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Williams, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me begin with this. Were you aware that the informant that you were working with was a Chinese national?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, first off, that informant was approved under the previous administration, as was the investigation. But yes, the CPI was a Chinese national working for a Chinese company that we were investigating for their criminal activities. So yes, sir.
Did the service do any due diligence to determine what connections the Chinese national may have with the CCP or with the Politburo or Politburo members in their role with this Chinese company?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, the service absolutely followed all protocols for using a CPI of a foreign national.
So you did the due diligence to look at any connections there to any entity connected to the CCP or the Politburo?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, I did not myself, but I know that our Office of Law Enforcement officers followed all procedures.
We know subsequent to his work that the Chinese national was offered placement here in the United States, security, also job placement. Can you give me some idea about what efforts were made and where he was placed in a job here in the United States?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, no, I cannot answer that question directly because of the ongoing investigation, but I can say that we worked with Homeland Security and the State Department and the Department of Justice in bringing this CPI into the country so that we would be able to use his testimony.
Was there any connection with the attempts to gain employment for him with organizations that inquired with the Fish and Wildlife Service concerning their concerns about the use of these monkeys in research and the illegal trade of these monkeys from Cambodia?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. You know, there's always a challenge as we see what happened with COVID and we see the associations with medical research in China and then medical research in the United States, all the way from things like active pharmaceutical ingredients to medical research here. Is there anything or any concern about the efforts that you are undertaking using a Chinese national in what could have been, in that particular case, an effort by China to gain an advantage in medical research? Obviously, these primates, while we all care about these primates and want to make sure that they are treated properly, we know too that there is a high degree of importance in medical research, especially with groundbreaking medical technologies that are able to save lives. Again, the balance needs to be struck there, but are there concerns about what this could do to give China a competitive advantage in that realm of medical research? In other words, are there things that potentially could have happened here with the effort to understand if there's an illegal trade with these monkeys that could be something that was to China's interest to be able to interrupt that effort by the United States in using primates in medical research?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Whitman, I mean, of course, that's something we would always pay attention to. There was no ever an intent to, support Chinese research or anything like that. With the interesting piece of this case, I think that has been missed, is that this was a Chinese company operating in Cambodia. And the very fact that if wild macaques were laundered and brought into the captive bred macaque community, it could undermine those law-abiding, legally operating biomedical companies in this country and undermined bringing in zoonotic diseases. The reason long-tailed macaques are used for research is they're so close to it's just they're really good for research. So it's the contrary. By laundering wild macaques into captive bred facilities, that undermines the procedures that law-abiding biomedical companies adhere to in this country. We at the Fish and Wildlife Service are working with the National Association of Biomedical Research to make sure there are protocols in place so that wild macaques, especially those with diseases, wild macaques are not illegally laundered and brought into our country and undermining our competitive advantage.
Gotcha.
Thank you for your question.
I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I
The
yield back.
gentlewoman, the ranking member from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that Fish and Wildlife Service actually has a law enforcement division. These are commissioned officers that engage with the FBI, the CIA, international law enforcement, local police. These folks carry guns. They're dealing with cartels. They're dealing with international human traffickers. They're dealing with really bad people. Is that correct?
Yes, Ranking Member Stansberry, they put their lives on the line every day to protect our country.
And I think it's important that people understand that wildlife trafficking is not just about the wildlife, though that is very, very important, and let's be clear about that. We're talking about primates that are classified not only as endangered here in the United States, but they're also classified internationally under the UN as endangered species. And so we've got a Chinese-based company, a Chinese-owned company, that is essentially using a third party in Cambodia to go capture primates that are endangered in the wild, then changing the papers so that they can illegally transport them into the United States and sell them to an American company in order to do biomedical research. That is essentially the outline of the case. Is that correct?
Ranking Member Stansberry, yes.
And in many cases, these companies that are involved in international wildlife trafficking are, and I'm not saying in this case because I don't have all of the background on this company, but in many, many cases, and this is what Fish and Wildlife encounters every day, these folks are wrapped up in international cartels, crime syndicates, there's human trafficking, there's gun trafficking going on. Like, there is serious crimes in addition to the animal crimes that are occurring. And so the reason why we crack down on these crimes is not only because the implications for research and what that will mean for biomedical research in the United States, not only because it's illegal here in the United States, not only because it's bad for the animals themselves and for the ecosystems that they're a part of, but because it's part of international crime. And I want to point out that this very committee has already held 6 committee hearings about the border and about international crime. And yet I'm hearing my friends across the aisle trying to bend over backwards to defend international wildlife traffickers. It is hard to wrap my mind around. I'm just going to put it that way. So let's just talk here for a moment about this specific case. It's my understanding from speaking to folks at Fish and Wildlife and from the background materials of this case that it is an ongoing investigation, and that one of the judges who was involved in trying the first defendant said that absolutely there was a crime committed. Is that correct?
Congressman or Ranking Member Stansberry,
If you don't have it in front of you, I will read the quote. Yeah, so the quote from Judge Williams says, "To say again, I think this jury and any jury would absolutely convict Vanny," this is the Chinese-based company that's involved in this international cartel, "and its personnel because they have been proved to be criminally culpable." So why are we trying this case in the House Natural Resources Committee? It is being tried by law enforcement and the judiciary. So I find it very strange that this committee is monkeying around, no pun intended, in a trial involving international crime syndicates as it's actively being investigated by federal law enforcement with a criminal syndicate that we know a judge and a jury have already said have criminal culpability. So, Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate that we're shining a light on this issue, because I do believe that we should be finding alternatives, and we do have these 1,000 individual primates that are stuck in limbo because of this case, and that is inhumane, and these animals should be transferred to a sanctuary. But I do not think it is appropriate for Congress to be using its resources to interfere in a criminal trial right now. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I'll address myself. Ms. Williams, as the U.S. and Cambodia are both parties to CITES, right?
Mr. Chair, that's correct, along with there are 184 parties to
Yeah, I understand
CITES.
that, but why did the service choose to completely ignore the treaty and try to prosecute this foreign activity in a U.S. court?
Mr. Chair, we actually were not ignoring the CITES treaty, but we're enforcing it. In addition to this case, the CITES Secretariat themselves are investigating this as well.
But once again, you're on a foreign country's turf, and you have to go through those treaty obligations. You just don't. You have to have the goodwill of that country, don't you not?
Mr. Chair, absolutely, but we also, the point of CITES is that you adhere to the requirements of CITES, and in this instance, the Cambodian government was issuing fraudulent CITES permits to fraudulently and dangerously bring wild long-tailed macaques into this country and negatively impact our own biomedical research here.
Okay, so then how do you explain the leaked information that showed up in the PETA and regarding the indictment and trial for this operation?
Mr. Chair, I am not aware of any leak.
Yeah, so you say that PETA never had these documents and pictures? They had none of this?
Mr. Chair, I am not aware of PETA having anything that wasn't in the public record.
Well. So I'm really confused here now. So PETA has information that is pertinent to the indictments of these individuals. How'd that happen?
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware, as I said, I'm not aware of PETA having any information that was not in the public record. But what I would clarify too, I want to make sure everyone knows that when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gets information, we deem it credible and we've corroborated it, we should use that regardless of its source, as long as it's accurately corroborated.
So is somebody guilty if they're just automatically guilty and they have to prove themselves innocent, or are they innocent until proven guilty?
Mr. Chair, certainly the law pertains here, and so they're
So what is-
innocent until proven guilty.
Just checking on that. Yes, I would like to submit for the record the recorded interview of Mr. McCree. Without objection, so ordered. Now, I know you don't have much of a science background, but I'm going to still ask this question anyway. What are our options? I mean, you heard the ranking member talk about these primates in limbo. You know, we can do AI. You know, now we have the ability to make human bladders and all sorts of different things. When is some of this going to stop with these primates? What options will we have? And how long do you see us giving options before we get inducing dogs, cats, primates?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I understand your
How long do you think
question.
it's going to take us to get past these animal trials and start doing them on human formed bladders and stuff like that?
Mr. Chair, I believe that there actually are some methods that are in place now that don't require research on non-human primates, but nonetheless, I want to be clear that there's not been a ban on non-human primates in this country, and there are CITES permits and CITES legal traded wildlife that come into this country every day, thanks to our Office of Law Enforcement investigators who are at the borders securing our nation's security as these and other illegally traded goods come into this country.
I understand that, but my question is in your opinion, how long is it going to take us to get away from these animal trials? Point blank.
Mr. Chair, I'll have to get back to you, but I do know there is some research that happens without it.
So my last comment is just for the record, in this trial, the company under discussion, Avee, which is headquartered in Hong Kong, was not charged. Okay. With that, I think we're done with our questions, and I will dismiss the witness and go to panel 2.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, on the last comment, the remaining indictments, the 7 remaining indictments, 6 of them were those who worked for that Chinese Vanny that were Chinese nationals that worked for Vanny. So that's actually the company employees were part of this.
Well, you know, I guess my question is that going back to my first question, there was a treaty under CITES, and it seems like the United States did what they wanted to do. I'm just saying that they didn't follow the treaty obligations and go through Cambodia first. And so I think there's a lot of missed problems with this, whether it be in a war, whether it be the transfer of primates. I think we've got a serious misgivings about our position in the world that we can violate any law we want to, whenever we want to. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Williamson, and appreciate it. And it'll take a 5-minute break until the second panel can get put up to place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wisconsin. Third, Mr. Thomas Gillespie, Professor and Chair, Department of Environmental Sciences, Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia. And finally, Dr. Chris Abee, Professor Emeritus, MD Anderson Cancer Center, the University of Texas, Page, Texas. Let me remind the witnesses that under the committee rules, you must limit your statement for five minutes. However, your entire comments and your record will be placed in the record. I will now start by recognizing Mr. Pelletier for his first 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for your time this morning, and thank you to the committee for its time and attention in this most important matter. Let me start by being blunt. The costly 5-year undercover investigation and subsequent trial of a Cambodian government official by the Fish and Wildlife Service was an abject failure. This disastrous investigation and prosecution was the direct result of a severely flawed and unsupervised plan. The government's conduct was unlawful, and institutional bias of the Fish and Wildlife was nothing short of a misguided effort to obstruct the importation and transportation of non-human primates, or NHPs, for critical medical, vaccine, and drug research. This illegal effort has resulted in a negative global impact to human health and has damaged medical research in the United States. It has been consistently apparent that the Fish and Wildlife, under the influence of PETA and other so-called animal advocacy groups, was more focused on a relentless publicity campaign. This half-decade PR campaign began when the Fish and Wildlife investigation was transparently dubbed Operation Longtail Liberation. It was then carried out through the recruitment of an unmonitored and uncontrolled Chinese national as a U.S.-paid illegal undercover informant. And what did all this effort and expense yield? First, the dismissal of 6 of 8 charges against the Cambodian official in response to the government's mismanagement and withholding of evidence. Then, the jury acquitted the Cambodian official of the remaining 2 charges, rejecting the government's allegations completely. It is now clear that the government never actually possessed evidence to support the charges against the Cambodian official. Prior to the trial in Miami, I spent months reviewing Fish and Wildlife's so-called evidence and then watched every day of the trial in person. I'll lay this out for you plainly. First, starting in 2017, a Chinese national was recruited and paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by Fish and Wildlife to act in an effectively unsupervised and undercover role as the agency conducted its off-the-books operation at a large NHP breeding farm in Cambodia, which for many years had reliably sold NHPs to importers in the United States and other countries. Rather than actually liberate any long-tail macaques, which of course is not the mission of Fish and Wildlife's Office of Law Enforcement, it is apparent that the agency repeatedly broke international laws by conducting the undercover operation on foreign soil without the proper consent of either Cambodian or U.S. State Department officials. In so doing, Fish and Wildlife endangered American citizens by causing the complete cessation of imports of any NHPs from Cambodia, which was by far the largest supplier of NHPs to the United States, especially since 2020, when a ban on the exportation of Chinese-bred NHPs due to COVID went into effect. While Fish and Wildlife was conducting its 5-year illegal operation, it continued to authorize the entry into the United States of tens of thousands of NHPs that they now claim, without any credible evidence, were exported illegally into the United States. It doesn't end there. As Fish and Wildlife's illegal operation continued, the government unconstitutionally labeled my client, Worldwide Primates, an unindicted co-conspirator, when, according to the Fish and Wildlife's own paid Chinese operative, the government absolutely knew that my client had no involvement in any criminal activity. Despite the acquittal, as we have confirmed with public records requests and evidence admitted at trial, Fish and Wildlife's undercover Chinese operative remained on the agency's payroll, earning tens of thousands of more taxpayer dollars in yet another covert international investigation in Cambodia, this one aptly codenamed Operation Monkey Business. Incredibly, the government then moved the Chinese national and his family to the United States at taxpayer expense. In sum, Mr. Chairman, Fish and Wildlife's refusal to abide by the long-held, demonstrably effective protocols already set forth in the International CITES Treaty, in which Fish and Wildlife plays a central enforcement role, has set back international cooperation for decades, all because Fish and Wildlife and the DOJ have lost sight of their established missions. Instead, they have taken sides with private sector radical animal rights groups like PETA to prevent U.S. government-mandated and essential commerce of NHPs for our vital domestic bioscience and vaccine research program. The indictment, not CITES, effectively removed Cambodia as a supplier of captive-bred NHPs for export to only the United States. Fish and Wildlife is now implementing a de facto ban on importing any NHPs bred in captive breeding centers in Cambodia, none of which were referenced in the indictment or in any official records. These disastrous consequences disadvantaged only United States stakeholders, namely scientific researchers and their suppliers. Other countries such as Canada, Japan, and Korea remain free to import import from Cambodia under valid CITES permits. Meanwhile, China continues its primate bioscience research unabated. After implementing its 22 export ban, China can now advance scientific research to the detriment of the United States healthcare organizations and the American public's need for cures and vaccines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pelletier. Now I recognize Dr. Clemons for her 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first I wish to say thank you to the committee for having this hearing and for inviting me to provide information that I hope will be helpful to the discussion. As a career research veterinarian, I've been motivated by my deep love and respect for animals and by a desire to support the advancement of science and medicine to improve human and animal health. Most of my work has been in the private sector, supporting drug development in research areas where there's high and immediate applicability to human health. The pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors in this country rely on non-human primates for medical research, particularly for later stage development and evaluation of potential medicines. In the earlier stages, efforts are focused on modeling in vitro non-animal methods and typically other animal models such as rats and mice. Once a potential medicine has reached a key stage of development, it is usually necessary to evaluate the safety and efficacy of it in a species with systems more similar to humans. Drug development is a long and costly process, taking many years from concept of a drug until a medicine is available for patient use. Many medicines don't make it to the patient over safety concerns or a lack of adequate effectiveness. It's just as important that an under-effective or an unsafe product not be made to make it to the market as it is to have an effective drug. And yes, there is a sense of urgency involved. Patients with serious illnesses for autoimmune disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, and others are waiting for these medications. Non-human primates, the long-tailed macaque being the most used, have immune, reproductive, neurologic, digestive, and cardiovascular systems with tremendous similarity to human system functions and provide predictability regarding the human response to medicine. These animals have been instrumental in the creation of many of today's medicines and treatments, and as a result, the pharmaceutical industry relies on a consistent, reliable supply chain from both domestic and foreign breeders to meet their research needs. Imported animals are a critical component of the supply chain and have been for many years. A brief explanation of why importation and large breeding facilities need to exist. The long-tailed macaque has only one birth per year of a single infant. In a well-managed facility, this means we can have 70 to 80 births expected for a colony of about 100 females and 10 to 15 males. This number of offspring, when grown, will support 2 late-stage pharmaceutical research projects. Breeding and rearing healthy, research-appropriate animals has been done in large numbers in countries where the climate is suitable for this semi-tropical species. As a research veterinarian, it was part of my job to evaluate the health and general condition of animals, including the non-human primates being purchased for research. My evaluation of the animal supply included a review of suppliers, auditing their animal care programs, and in many cases, conducting on-site inspections of the facilities themselves. These audits focused on the facilities, their sanitation, medical care, nutrition, the welfare of the animals, the staff training, and the behavior of the animals. In general, I found earnest, knowledgeable staff with a genuine concern for the animals and their care that were being well treated. I saw breeding facilities with healthy offspring in family units, adolescent animals housed in group settings, and adult animals being prepared for transport. Over the course of my decades-long career, the general health of these animals has only improved as the breeding facilities have become more sophisticated in their general management, design, medical care, and nutrition. From my perspective, having worked in the above capacity, I'm aware of the view in the research community that it is being discriminated against by federal agencies that regulate these activities, whereby individuals who may personally disapprove of animal research are potentially abusing the power of their positions to influence policy, including, for example, treating research organizations differently from other animal enterprises by slow-walking import and export applications and other actions, including those discussed today. These behaviors have had a negative impact on medical research in the United States. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clemons. Now I turn to Dr. Gillespie for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. I'm doing so in my personal capacity. The views I express are my own and do not necessarily represent my employer or other bodies on which I serve. I am Thomas Gillespie, Professor and Chair of Environmental Sciences and Professor of Environmental Health at Emory University and Rollins School of Public Health in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior to my current position, I was a professor of veterinary medicine and anthropology at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. I am also a member of the IUCN Primate Specialist Group and an external expert to PREZODE, a multinational effort to prevent zoonotic disease emergence. For over 2 decades, my research has examined risk factors for zoonotic disease transmission at the human-primate interface. I'm here to address a critical issue that threatens both public health and wildlife conservation: the trade in wild macaques for biomedical research. Long-tailed macaques, Macaca fascicularis, are used for biomedical and pharmaceutical research due to their genetic and physiological similarities to humans. Unfortunately, these same traits make macaques excellent reservoirs for pathogens that can infect us and potentially lead to disease outbreaks in humans. Considering the number of animals traded and the zoonotic potential of each animal, macaques show the highest average volume of potential zoonotic disease of all wildlife traded. Furthermore, some of these pathogens can alter the immune system of monkeys, confounding the results of studies examining the effects of a drug or vaccines being tested on monkey subjects. For these reasons, U.S. research facilities have, for decades, expected healthy, pathogen-free, captive-bred macaques sourced from controlled facilities. The COVID pandemic-related reduction in the availability of captive-bred long-tailed macaques appears to have resulted in the importation of substantial numbers of wild macaques labeled as captive-bred and pathogen-free. Since this time, multiple cases of melioidosis have been diagnosed in macaques imported from Cambodia. Melioidosis is a potentially fatal disease caused by a Tier 1 select agent, Burkholderia pseudomallii, which is endemic to much of the geographic range of long-tailed macaques. Equally troubling, CDC data indicate the prevalence of culture-confirmed tuberculosis in imported non-human primates was only 0 from 2013 to 2020, but has increased since the pandemic. Both Burkholderia and tuberculosis can present asymptomatically in macaques, and false negatives to approved diagnostic tests for both pathogens are not uncommon. Therefore, it's not surprising that multiple cases of TB among imported monkeys were reported to CDC up to 2 years post-quarantine. Even more concerning, there were the 6 cases of melioidosis detected among long-tailed macaques imported from Cambodia. 4 of these cases were not detected until months after the monkeys had entered the U.S. and been transported to other facilities. Both tuberculosis and buccal are capable of infecting and causing disease in a broad range of mammalian hosts, including humans, domesticated animals, and livestock. And environmental conditions in the southern United States could promote establishment of buccal, which can be shed in the urine, feces, blood, and saliva of infected animals. Other than TB, CDC does not currently require screening to be performed in apparently healthy non-human primates during the CDC-mandated 31-day quarantine period. If importers choose to screen apparently healthy animals for zoonotic infections during the quarantine period, positive results must be reported to CDC within 24 hours. Consequently, TB and buccal are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of zoonotic threats to the American public. Most future emerging infectious diseases remain to be discovered, and the tropical forest habitat of the long-tailed macaques is a known hotspot. I applaud U.S. Fish and Wildlife for their efforts to combat illegal wildlife trade, and I encourage Congress to increase resources available to U.S. Fish and Wildlife to facilitate their efforts. Further, I encourage research facilities making use of primate models to commit to ending the use of wild-caught primates, to carefully review the sourcing of primates, and to actively promote the use of alternative research strategies that do not involve capture of wild human primates. I hope these details have clarified the critical importance of ending the wild macaque trade. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I welcome questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie. Now, Dr. Abee, it's your turn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar and the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Chris Abee. I'm a veterinarian and an emeritus professor at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, retired. For over 40 years, I studied the biology and diseases of non-human primates and conducted research to find better ways to treat and prevent both human and animal diseases. My testimony today aims to highlight the importance of long-tailed macaques and other non-human primates in biomedical research. Of the approximately 70,000 primates used in research annually, almost half are long-tailed macaques imported from Asia. These animals are crucial for pharmaceutical studies and for publicly funded research to advance our understanding of disease prevention and treatment. We use the term non-human primate because humans are also primates. This phylogenetic proximity between human and non-human primates makes them invaluable in biomedical research. Their genomes are approximately 95% identical to the human genome, resulting in many body systems such as the immune system and the cardiovascular system, renal system, respiratory system, all closely resembling those of humans. A report published last year by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, titled Non-Human Primate Models in Biomedical Research, State of the Science and Future Needs, concluded that research requiring non-human primates remains essential to our country's biomedical discovery and translational research pipeline. In recent years, the COVID-19 pandemic placed enormous pressure on our country's domestic primate research resources. During this time, China, our primary source of imported primates, halted exports to the United States. This action sharply increased the cost of these animals from $5,000 to as much as $50,000 each, effectively pricing out scientists with NIH grants. Simultaneously, animal rights organizations have attempted to use the Endangered Species Act and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reclassify these animals as endangered species. Such a classification would make them unavailable for research. Therefore, the decision to reclassify a species as endangered must be based on very solid scientific data and taken very seriously. The U.S. leads the world in biomedical research, but our country's leadership is fragile. China has openly expressed its intention to replace the U.S. as the world leader in biomedical research. They have built primate research facilities with capacity far surpassing the U.S. and have no restrictions on primate use in research. In conclusion, I hope I've conveyed the importance of non-human primates to the country's biomedical research programs. I urge Congress to consider directing the NIH and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop action plans ensuring both supply and availability of primates for publicly and privately funded medical research. These plans should be developed by outside committees of experts rather than the NIH and U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff. In my opinion, this will only happen with a congressional mandate. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abee. That's just you and me, so you're up. The ranking member is recognized for her 5 minutes.
All right, well, thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Pelletier, is that the correct pronunciation of your name?
Yes, it is.
I apologize.
It's good enough.
I just wanted to clarify your role here today. You mentioned in your testimony that you're here on behalf of your client, Worldwide Primates, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're here in that formal capacity, you're representing that person as your client,
I
correct?
am, yes.
Yeah, and it's a family-owned business owned by a Mr. Matthew Block, is that correct?
No, it's not. It's owned by Ira Block.
Oh,
Matthew
Ira
Block's
Block,
son.
but Matt Block is a former CEO, manager, owner,
Yes.
family owner. And just to be clear, Mr. Block was convicted and spent 13 months in prison for smuggling baby orangutans, correct?
No, he wasn't. He was convicted in 1990, pled guilty almost 25 years ago, if not more, for participating in a scheme to submit false paperwork for baby orangutans entering Russia, yes.
So for the smuggling of primates into another country using a third party.
Correct.
So I appreciate that clarification. I want to turn to our witness who's here with us from Emory. One of the things that I find so strange about this whole network of illegal smuggling, and I think our last witness really highlighted the worldwide shortage is, of course, causing challenges for research, and we understand that. But is the actual implications for research. So I know, Mr. Gillespie, Dr. Gillespie, you're an expert in zoonotics. If wild versus laboratory-raised animals are used in research, could it alter the outcomes of tests and trials of drugs?
Ranking Member Stansberry, it absolutely can. The fact that many pathogens can modify the effect of immune function means that you can have confounding results where it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to distinguish between the effect of pre-existing infections versus a vaccine-mounted response for a test of that nature, or if you're purposefully infecting to look at the impacts of a given pathogen.
So you would want to, and again, I think I made my position clear in the first panel that I support alternatives to animal testing, but strictly from a scientific and medical standpoint, you want controls in a study to make sure that the animals that you are conducting trials and tests on, that you understand their provenance, where they came from, so that you can control for factors that might affect the outcome of that drug trial, is essentially what we're saying, right? And so the thing that I guess I find strange about the sort of cover up in these international animal trafficking situations and the complicity of American-based companies and research institutions is, wouldn't you want animals that have a clear provenance? Because it could affect the outcome of your medical trials. Is that correct?
Ranking Member Stansberry, absolutely. It's a critical issue for the biosecurity of our medical research, as well as the biosecurity of our populations and our animal production for agriculture as well.
So why do you think that American-based research institutions are not pushing for clear enforcement of these regulations? Why are they not being more detailed in their due diligence, and why are they purchasing from companies that may be US-based or foreign-based that are potentially bringing in smuggled animals?
Ranking Member Stansberry, the specifics that are beyond my expertise, but as an individual, I would assume that it's because greater profits can be made, or there's ability to get around the rules that are in place.
I think I'm asking more about US-based institutions, and I'm a bit of a recovering academic myself, though certainly not in this field. I think that there is, I guess what I'm trying to drive at is that there is an onus on American institutions and research institutions, especially those funded by the US government, to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, to make sure that any kind of tests that we conduct are being done with full legality, whether that's international treaties, using animals that are appropriately sourced, and that it also falls incumbent on us in the United States to make sure that we're doing that as well. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Clemons, to clarify, can you clarify the provenance issues? And in your expertise in working with these institutions, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so can you repeat that, please?
Yes, can you clarify provenance issues and what your expertise is in handling this with institutions?
Okay, so I've worked in thank you for the question. I've worked in the private sector my entire career for a contract research organization and for a major pharmaceutical company. As part of my role there, I was tasked with looking into the background of animals, the suppliers that we were doing business with as companies, and looking into the welfare of animals. Specifically, welfare of the animals was the primary charge as my veterinary role. So I looked at much documentation related to these animals, their history of work, and also looking into, as I said in my statement before, I researched these facilities and visited most of them during the course of my career. So I've been to several countries looking at animals and found all of them that I was able to look at to be operating in good condition with clarity in their paperwork and clarity in their interactions with us. It was clearly in the interests of my organizations to have ethically obtained animals.
So the comment was made about how much, it seems to me like we would, if the macaques are such a big deal here, that we would have our own supply. What would it take for the United States to have their own supply? Or do you have to inbreed more different genetics?
Okay, so yes, thank you for that question as well. I think there is an interest in having more of a domestic supply in the U.S. I've certainly seen that, but there's several factors involved. One is it would take a tremendous number of animals to produce what is needed for research. Just to take the number 20,000, for instance, as an example of annual use, which is not, by the way, anywhere close to what the actual need is in the U.S., this would still require a colony of approximately 130,000 breeders, adolescents, and young animals being reared in order to produce 20,000 animals per year. Now, that also requires many years of development for us to create a facility of that size. It's very expensive. It's going to take a lot of importation of breeding animals. So over time, I expect this would take many years, as there would not be enough breeder animals imported in one go to get that started. The last factor I might want to mention here is that there have been numerous attempts by companies to begin major breeding colonies, and animal rights organizations have consistently worked to block the development and building of those facilities.
So I'm going to ask the question to you and Dr. Abee. You know, we're talking about diseases like dementia, we're talking about MS, a lot of different things possible. Can you give me an idea if there's anything on the horizon that IA or synthetic human cells can actually bust some of these tests with? Okay. What's on the future?
What's in the future? Well, what we have right now is some very promising technology. It's in early stage. To use one example, for instance, the organ on a chip gets a lot of attention. And it should. It's a promising technology, but what it is one very, very small piece of tissue from one specific individual person or animal being tested. It does not look at the complex interaction of multiple organ systems in a complex living being. So this is very promising. It's a good adjunct technology that is being used right now, may become much more prominent in the future, but for now it's not mature science, and it has not replaced the need for complex species.
Dr. Abee?
I referenced the National Academy's report that was published last year. I had the opportunity to serve on that consensus committee that wrote that report, and the committee included a number of scientists that were expert in developing new approach methodologies. So the committee was composed of scientists who work with animals and scientists that work to develop new approach methodologies. And the consensus was that the new approach methodologies are, as Dr. Clemons said, not mature enough to meet all of our needs. In some cases, we're able to use non-animal approaches, and wherever we can, we do. But the need for primates, and this was a consensus, unanimous of the entire committee, was that we absolutely have to have non-human primates for the foreseeable future. And one surprise to me in serving on that committee is that scientists working on new approach methods said we need the primates in order to validate the new approaches that we're developing.
Mm-hmm. I thank you. Hold those thoughts, because I'm going to come back. We'll do a second round. So I'm going to go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pelletier, did I pronounce that right?
Sure, well, that's good enough, thank you.
I'm a South Georgia boy, so we ain't got too many. Once you get past Jones now, it gets a little tough. Given your expertise in this case and your experience at the Department of Justice, you have a unique perspective on this matter. So in your testimony, you highlighted some of the illegal and outrageous activities carried out by the service and its paid informant in this matter. Can you quickly summarize some of the most problematic actions taken by the service during this investigation?
Yes, I can. So, Congressman, thank you for the question. First thing I would tell you is that they opened the investigation in 2017, called it Operation Longtail Liberation. They had spoken with the Chinese national, and he told them he had no information with respect to any wildlife being shipped as wild caught to the United States. Yet they opened the investigation, called it Operation Longtail Liberation, And number two, he was in it for the money. As a prosecutor, I know that those witnesses that are in it for the money are specifically have to be supervised very well. In this case, the whole case was about tracing the monkeys to the United States and proving they were wild caught. They couldn't do that. As a matter of fact, the Chinese national didn't even attempt to trace the animals until he came to the United States in 2022 and was paid $100,000. And then he started tracing the monkeys.
So given that lack of evidence, or whatever you want to call it, what do you think motivated the DOJ and the service to go forward with this ill-fated trial?
It's very clear what motivated them. They were trying to do a stunt to absolutely stop the trade. It's not about conservation, it's about eradication of this trade. PETA and the Department of Justice and Fish and Wildlife Service are in cahoots, and we're in cahoots during this whole trial. And we know that because the Fish and Wildlife was sharing secretly information with PETA so they could post it on their website.
So, and in your testimony, you know, you reference PETA, Cruelty Free International, as well as actions taken by the service to restrict trade on non-human primates that are really crippling the domestic industry. Can you elaborate on the actions the service has taken that have and are having such a negative effect on our domestic industry?
Yeah, I mean, my expertise is only goes so far in that area, but what I can absolutely tell you is they avoided using CITES here, right? So for 5 years, they conducted this, quote, investigation and continued to allow 20,000 or more NHPs into the United States that Fish and Wildlife Service tells us are wild caught. Why would you do that when there's an international treaty that perfectly addresses any concerns in that arena? They just let them in. And then we have Fish and Wildlife Service telling or asking PETA if they can find a place for these 1,000 monkeys that we've talked about before they even unseal the indictment. Before they even unseal the indictment. So they're talking about actually seizing monkeys and stopping the monkeys after they let them into the United States, number one. But number two, they're discussing it before the indictment is unsealed. And those monkeys did not come from the Vanny farm. So it is a level of coordination that is, to me, despicable, number one, because it's not the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service to eradicate this trade, but it has basically stopped the trade from Cambodia of any NHPs, and they were the largest source for medical research.
So, yeah, you know, you've just heard you state that they've taken sides with the private sector, these radical animal groups, you know, to prevent the U.S. government mandated an essential commerce of non-human primates for important domestic bioscience and vaccine research programs. So, you know, as a federal prosecutor and as well as a private sector litigator, what are your thoughts on how to really address this problem?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that need to be done here. One is I think there has to be a recognition by Fish and Wildlife Service there's a problem here. I think if you talk to any of these doctors on the panel, particularly Dr. Clemons and Dr. Abee, they can tell you that in their business, Fish and Wildlife Service has always been hostile to the trade and to research, always. So I think there needs to be a change in that dynamic. I also think that the conduct here that I've outlined in my statement needs to be referred to the IG and or to OPR. I think that's it. And then finally, what I'd love is an ability for Fish and Wildlife Service, for someone, an honest broker at Fish and Wildlife Service, to be able to talk with the experts in the arena, the people who import the monkeys. If there's a problem, they know more than anybody, and they should be talking with us, not talking to PETA about these issues.
Thank you. Okay, we can go right, okay, all right. I'm hard of hearing, you know. Mr. Abee, could you please explain why the long-tailed macaque is the most needed non-human primate for pharmaceutical studies?
That species of primate has been used for many, many years, which means that we've carried out many, many studies on these animals, so they're very highly characterized. That means that when we use them in a research project and we see anything unusual in the animals in the research project, we can determine more precisely why that has occurred, if it's a test article or it's an experimental manipulation. So it's the large amount of background data that we have on this species that make them very important.
Can you think of any medical treatments we would not have today if primates were not available for research?
Almost every major drug that we use today, and it has been developed over the last 20 to 30 years, at some stage in the process of developing that drug, non-human primates were needed. Very often, it's in the later stages, what we call the translational research stages, where we are attempting to translate what we have found and translate it into whether it would be applicable to humans. Non-human primates are particularly good at that. This is very important in large molecule therapeutics, which are extremely important today. These drugs, such as Humira, they're monoclonal antibodies that were developed, and primates helped us develop those. And these drugs are used in all of the autoimmune diseases which are growing in our country. If you look at the statistics, autoimmune disease is becoming epidemic.
So if PETA and other animal rights groups received their wish and primates were banned from research and testing, what'll happen?
Well, in biomedical research, what would happen is that the development of new therapies, new drugs, new ways to treat disease would either be delayed or would never occur. In biomedical research, I like to say that time is lives. When we were developing the COVID-19 vaccine very, very rapidly, we could do the arithmetic. Without the vaccine, we knew how many people were dying, and with the vaccine, we knew we could reduce it. The development of that vaccine quickly, and non-human primates were involved, saved many, many lives.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to go back to one quick thing. Mr. Pelletier, did the government promise the court it would be able to trace the non-human primates delivered by Mr. Cree to the U.S. to support all the charges in the indictment?
It did, and what was even more, thank you, Congressman, yes, it did. What was even more unusual, it didn't do it. And what happened is the government themselves moved to dismiss 5 of the charges when they weren't able to prove it. And you know, as a prosecutor for 25 years, I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen anything like that. They promised and didn't fulfill. That's unusual.
So I want to say that too. So the government did promise the court, but then they didn't deliver.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, that's all I have. I can yield back.
The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, the ranking member, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Abee or Abee? Abee. Okay, thank you very much. Did I hear just a few moments ago that you said that you participate in the National Academies, that you participated in a National Academies Review Board?
I'm sorry, could you repeat, please?
Did I hear you say a few moments ago that you had participated in a National Academies panel?
Yes.
Yes.
I served on their consensus committee in preparing that report.
Thank you. So you recognize the importance of science-based organizations in making sure that we have the most synthesized, up-to-date science and making decision-making, obviously, because you're participating in one of the most important bodies that does that. And are you familiar with the IUCN, which is the international body that makes recommendations regarding ecosystems and animals?
I know of IUCN. I'm certainly not an expert on the organization.
Definitely. Well, I'll just say that there's a direct analogy to the national academies, because the IUCN is an advisory board that is a science-based organization that makes recommendations to UN bodies around the state of the science for the protection of animals and ecosystems. So it's science-based. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that I want to read to you all the consensus science about the status of long-tailed macaques. And this comes out of actually PubMed, which is put out by the National Institutes of Health. In 2022, long-tailed macaques, a once ubiquitous primate species, was elevated to endangered on the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List of Threatened Species. That's the IUCN. And in 2023, recognizing that long-tailed macaque is threatened by multiple factors, including declining native habitats across Southeast Asia, overutilization for scientific, commercial, and recreational purposes, inadequate regulatory mechanisms, and culling due to human-macaque conflict. A petition for rulemaking was submitted to the U.S. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to add the species to the U.S. Endangered Species Act. So the reason why I wanted to read this is that there's been a lot of conversation in this hearing this morning arguing that the reason why Fish and Wildlife is trying to regulate primate trafficking is because of influence from animal rights organizations. But actually, it's science. The science says that these animals are declining and that they've declined precipitously over the last several years in the wild. And it's not just the United States, it's international organizations that have taken action to protect these animals. And that is why the United States is, and we are often, frankly, trailing the international community around the protection of wildlife and ecosystems. And so it is illegal to traffic in wild-caught animals. We understand from the conversation this morning that sourcing is a problem. There is not sufficient animals that are bred in captivity, as was just shared by one of our panelists, to meet the demand in the U.S. biomedical community. But it is illegal to traffic in wild-caught animals. And the reason is because they are precipitously declining because of these four factors, which the consensus of our scientific community has spoken loud and clear on this. So I just want folks to understand that's what we're talking about here. This is why Fish and Wildlife is regulating illegal, illicit trafficking in these animals. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlewoman. Dr. Abee, you mentioned China in your testimony. What will be the consequences to the U.S. and the world if China dominated this sector?
Well, what has happened is that China has invited American scientists to come to China to do their research. They have also offered to carry out what are called regulated studies that have to be done under the Good Laboratory Practices Act in order for those studies to be recognized by the FDA when developing a drug. But if you do a regulated study in China, at a test facility in China, you have to provide what is called a certificate of analysis to the test facility. You are forfeiting your intellectual property when you do that. They are supposed to keep it confidential, but there is great concern that that intellectual property is in jeopardy when a test facility in China carries out the research. So with that, it means that we would be forfeiting the development of new drugs in the United States in order that it be carried out in China, where the resources...
We saw what happened with COVID. You know, that came from China, so it's definitely a problem.
Well, it is definitely a problem, yes. I think that that if our research programs, in order to carry out the research, is moved to China, that we will be jeopardizing progress in biomedical research, because the United States is the world leader in that research right now.
So I want to get back to these populations. You know, if it's so important, then we ought to be breeding these populations. So if you were to design this, it's going to cost money regardless. It seems like we're stuck here. So what kind of population would you need, and what kind of inferences from outside sources would you have so that you had additional genetic material helping you breed this captive population, Dr. Clemons?
Well, we would need to build on the primate resources that we have in this country right now, both public and private. The National Institutes of Health funds 7 national primate research centers and a number of national research resources of non-human primates. But over the years, all of these centers have been underfunded. The funding from NIH has not kept up with inflation.
So let me ask you a question. I want to stop you right there. Why not the people that utilize these primates for their benefit? Because you have big pharma that's getting huge revenues. Why can't they pay part of this aspect?
Well, what has happened up until very recent years is that China provided these animals at a very low cost, a lower cost than what we could produce them in the United States.
But couldn't you incentivize that program? It seems to me we're living inside a box, and we're not looking outside the box for alternatives. It seems to me like a collaboration. You know, we're $36 trillion, $35.6 trillion in debt, to be honest, now, and we're looking at expenditures more. It seems like that we need the private sector to step up here. And it would be nice to see some type of collaboration here, so it's not all the government paying the money here. Do you see what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. I think there should be a public-private partnership, but the publicly funded primate resources are extremely important as well, because they serve publicly funded research programs, NIH grants.
Oh, I see the whole point there. You know, so that's my question about additional genetic material mass coming into that population. So, Mr. Pelletier, now, do you think it would be very appropriate for Congress to ask all NGOs if they take 1 penny from the federal government, they have to disclose all their resources and where they come from?
Yes, I think that it would be very appropriate, particularly finding out all of their communications with Fish and Wildlife Service. And if I might, I would say, to correct something the ranking member said, as it relates to macaques, there is no government in the world on God's green earth, including the United States, which recognizes macaques as endangered in any way, number one. Number two, wild caught are absolutely permitted to be imported into the United States if, in fact, they're properly declared as wild caught on the importation papers. And number three, IUCN is agreed that they're reevaluating their finding of endangered. So what the actions of Fish and Wildlife Service have done here have actually forced more wild caught to be shipped to the United States because we can't get captive bred out of Cambodia. So I'd just like to clarify that.
Well, the other question I want to answer is that how do you stop this? There has to be consequences for actions. Somebody has to be accountable for it. You know, so that's the biggest key. It starts with justice. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Now, the members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, September 13th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. I want to thank everybody. It was a very energetic and entertaining conversation. And with that, if there's no further business, subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.